Chapter 4. The Geography of Life. When on board HMS Beagle as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the inhabitants of South America, and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts seem to me to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers, Charles Darwin, on the origin of species. Some of the loneliest places on earth are the isolated volcanic islands of the southern oceans. On one of them, St. Helena, halfway between Africa and South America, Napoleon whiled away his last 5 years in British captivity, exiled from his native France. But the islands most famous for their isolation are those of the Juan Fernandez archipelago. 4 small specks of land, totaling about 40 square miles, and lying 400 miles west of Chile. For it was on one of these that Alexander Selkirk, the real-life Robinson Crusoe, lived out his solitary tenure as a castaway. Born Alexander Selkirk in 1676, Selkirk was a hot-tempered Scot who took to sea in 1703 as sailing master of the Cinque-Port, a British privateer deputized to plunder Spanish and Portuguese ships. Worried about the recklessness of his 21-year-old captain and the shoddy condition of the ship, Selkirk demanded to be put ashore, hoping for timely rescue, when the Cinque-Port stopped for food and water at Masatiera Island in the Juan Fernandez group. The captain obliged, and Selkirk was voluntarily marooned, taking ashore only clothes, bedding, some tools, a flintlock, tobacco, a kettle, and a Bible. Thus began 4.5 years of solitude. Masatiera was uninhabited, and besides Selkirk the only mammals were goats, rats, and cats, all of them introduced by earlier sailors. But after an initial period of loneliness and depression, Selkirk adapted to his circumstances, hunting goats and shellfish, eating fruits and vegetables planted by his predecessors, making fire by rubbing sticks together, fashioning goatskin clothes, and warding off rats by taming kittens to share his quarters. Selkirk was finally rescued in 1709 by a British ship, piloted, oddly enough, by the skipper of the original Cinque-Port. The crew was startled by the wild man in goatskins, who had been alone so long that his English could barely be understood. After helping replenish the ship with fruit and goat meat, Selkirk went aboard and made his way back to England. There he teamed up with a writer to produce a popular account of his adventures, The Englishman, said to have inspired Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Yet Selkirk could not adapt to a sedentary life ashore. He returned to sea in 1720 and died from a fever a year later off the African coast. The contingencies of time and character produced the story of Selkirk. But contingency is also the lesson of a greater story, the story of the non-human inhabitants of the Juan Fernandez group and other islands like it. For although Selkirk did not know it, Masatiera, now called Alejandro Selkirk Island, was inhabited by descendants of earlier castaways, the Robinson Crusoes of plants, birds, and insects, who found their way to the island by accident thousands of years before Selkirk. Unknowingly, he was living in a laboratory of evolutionary change. Today, the 3 islands of Juan Fernandez are a living museum of rare and exotic plants and animals, with many species that are endemic, found nowhere else in the world. Among them are 5 species of birds, including a giant 5-inch rust-brown hummingbird, the spectacular and endangered Juan Fernandez firecrown. 126 species of plants, including many bizarre members of the sunflower family, a fur seal, and a handful of insects. No comparable area anywhere in the world has so many endemic species. But the island is just as notable for what it is missing. It harbors not a single native species of amphibian, reptile, or mammal, groups that are common on continents throughout the world. This pattern of bizarre and efflorescent forms of endemic life, with many major groups strikingly absent, is repeated over and over again on oceanic islands. And as we'll see, the pattern gives striking evidence for evolution. It was Darwin who first took a hard look at these patterns. Through his own youthful travels on the HMS Beagle and his voluminous correspondence with scientists and naturalists, he realized that evolution was necessary to explain not just the origins and forms of plants and animals, but also their distributions across the globe. These distributions raised a lot of questions. Why did oceanic islands have such odd and unbalanced floras and faunas compared to continental assemblages? Why were nearly all of Australia's native mammals marsupials, while placental mammals dominated the rest of the world? And if species were created, why did the Creator stock distant areas having similar terrain and climate, like the deserts of Africa and of the Americas, with species that were superficially similar in form, but showed other, more fundamental differences? Pondering these questions, others before Darwin laid the groundwork for his own intellectual synthesis, one he considered so important that it occupies 2 whole chapters in The Origin. These chapters are often considered the founding document of the field of biogeography, the study of the distribution of species on Earth. And their evolutionary explanation of the geography of life, largely correct when first proposed, has only been refined and supported by a legion of later studies. This biographic evidence for evolution is now so powerful that I have never seen a creationist book, article, or lecture that has tried to refute it. Creationists simply pretend that the evidence doesn't exist. Ironically, the roots of biogeography lie deep in religion. The earliest natural theologians tried to show how the distribution of organisms could be reconciled with the account of Noah's Ark in the Bible. All living animals were understood as the descendants of the pairs that Noah took aboard, pairs that traveled to their present locations from the Ark's post-flood resting place, traditionally near Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey. But this explanation had obvious problems. How did kangaroos and giant earthworms make their way across the oceans to their present home in Australia? Wouldn't the pair of lions have quickly made a meal of the antelopes? And as naturalists continued to discover new species of plants and animals, even the staunchest believer realized that no boat could possibly hold them all, much less their food and water for a 6-week voyage. So another theory arose, that of multiple creations distributed across the Earth's surface. In the mid-1800s, the renowned Swiss zoologist Louis Agassiz, then at Harvard, asserted that not only were species immutable and static, but so were their distributions, with each remaining at or near their site of creation. But several developments also made this idea untenable, especially the increasing number of fossils disproving the claim that species were immutable and static. Geologists such as Charles Lyell, Darwin's friend and mentor, began to find evidence that the Earth was not only very old, but in flux. On the Beagle voyage, Darwin himself discovered fossil seashells high in the Andes, proving that what is now mountain was once underwater. Lands could rise or sink, and the continents we see today might have been larger or smaller in the past. And there were those unanswered questions about the distribution of species. Why was the flora of southern Africa so similar to that of southern South America? Some biologists proposed that all the continents were once connected by giant land bridges. Darwin grumbled to Lyell that these bridges were conjured up as easily as a cook does pancakes, but there was no evidence that they had ever existed. To deal with these difficulties, Darwin proposed his own theory. The distribution of species, he claimed, were explained not by creation but by evolution. If plants and animals had ways of dispersing over large distances and could evolve into new species after they dispersed, then this, combined with some ancient shifts in the earth like periods of glacial expansion, could explain many peculiarities of biogeography that had puzzled his predecessors. Darwin turned out to be right, but not completely. True, many facts about biogeography made sense if one assumed dispersal, evolution, and a changing Earth. But not every fact. The large flightless birds like ostriches, rheas, and emus occur in Africa, South America, and Australia respectively. If they all had a common flightless ancestor, how could they have possibly dispersed so widely? And why do eastern China and eastern North America, widely separated areas, share plants like tulip trees and skunk cabbage that don't occur in the intervening lands? We now have many of the answers that once eluded Darwin, thanks to two developments that he could not have imagined: continental drift and molecular taxonomy. Darwin appreciated that the Earth had changed over time, but he had no idea of how much change had actually taken place. Since the 1960s, scientists have known that the past geography of the world was very different from that of the present, as huge supercontinents have shifted about, joined, and separated into pieces. And starting about 40 years ago, we have accumulated information from DNA and protein sequences that tell us not only the evolutionary relationship between species, but also the approximate times when they diverged from common ancestors. Evolutionary theory predicts, and data support, the notion that as species diverge from their common ancestors, their DNA sequences change in roughly a straight-line fashion with time. We can use this molecular clock, calibrated with fossil ancestors of living species, to estimate the divergence times of species that have poor fossil records. Using the molecular clock, we can match the evolutionary relationships between species with the known movements of the continents, as well as the movements of glaciers and the formation of genuine land bridges such as the Isthmus of Panama. This tells us whether the origins of species are concurrent with the origin of new continents and habitats. These innovations have transformed biogeography into a grand detective story. Using a variety of tools and seemingly unconnected facts, biologists can deduce why species live where they do. We know now, for instance, that the similarities between African and South American plants are not surprising, for their ancestors once inhabited a supercontinent, Gondwana, that split into several pieces, now Africa, South America, India, Madagascar, and Antarctica, beginning about 170 million years ago. Every bit of biogeographic detective work turns out to support the fact of evolution. If species didn't evolve, their geographic distributions, both living and fossil, wouldn't make sense. We'll look first at species that live on continents, and then at those on islands, for these disparate areas provide different sorts of evidence. Continents. Let's begin with one observation that strikes anyone who travels widely. If you go to two distant areas that have similar climate and terrain, you find different types of life. Take deserts. Many desert plants are succulents. They show an adaptive combination of traits that include large, fleshy stems to store water, spines to deter predators, and small or missing leaves to reduce water loss. But different deserts have different types of succulents. In North and South America, the succulents are members of the cactus family. But in the deserts of Asia, Australia, and Africa, there are no native cacti. And the succulents belong to a completely different family, the euphorbs. You can tell the difference between the two types of succulents by their flowers and their sap, which is clear and watery in cacti, but milky and bitter in euphorbs. Yet despite these fundamental differences, cacti and euphorbs can look very much alike. I have both types growing on my windowsill, and visitors can't tell them apart without reading their tags. Why would a creator put plants that are fundamentally different, but look so similar, in diverse areas of the world that seem ecologically identical? Wouldn't it make more sense to put the same species of plants in areas with the same type of soil and climate? You might reply that, although the deserts appear similar, the habitats differ in subtle but important ways, and cacti and euphorbs were created to be best suited to their respective habitats. But this explanation doesn't work, For when cacti are introduced into Old World deserts, where they don't occur naturally, they do very well. The North American prickly pear cactus, for example, was introduced into Australia in the early 1800s, as settlers planned to extract a red dye from the cochineal beetle that feeds on the plant. This is the dye that gives the deep crimson color to Persian rugs. By the 20th century, the prickly pear had spread so rapidly that it became a serious pest, destroying thousands of acres of farmland and prompting drastic and ineffective eradication programs. The plant was finally controlled in 1926 by introducing the cactoblastis moth, whose caterpillars devour the cacti, one of the first and most successful examples of biological control. Certainly, prickly pear cacti can flourish in Australian deserts, though the native succulents are euphorbs. The most famous example of different species filling similar roles involves the marsupial mammals, now found mainly in Australia. The Virginia opossum is a familiar exception, and placental mammals, which predominate elsewhere in the world. The two groups show important anatomical differences, most notably in their reproductive systems. Almost all marsupials have pouches and give birth to very undeveloped young, while placentals have placentas that enable young to be born at a more advanced stage. Nevertheless, in other ways, some marsupials and placentals are astonishingly similar. There are burrowing marsupial moles that look and act just like placental moles, marsupial mice that resemble placental mice, the marsupial sugar glider, which glides from tree to tree just like a flying squirrel, and marsupial anteaters, which do exactly what South American anteaters do. Note, see Figure 20. Again, one must ask, if animals were specially created, why would the Creator produce on different continents fundamentally different animals that nevertheless look and act so much alike? It is not that marsupials are inherently superior to placentals in Australia, because introduced placental mammals have done very well there. Introduced rabbits, for example, are such serious pests in Australia that they are displacing native marsupials, such as the bilby, a small mammal with remarkably long ears. To help fund the eradication of rabbits, conservationists are campaigning to switch from the Easter bunny to the Easter bilby. Each spring, chocolate bilbies filled the shelves of Australian supermarkets. No creationist, whether of the Noah's Ark variety or otherwise, has offered a credible explanation for why different types of animals have similar forms in different places. All they can do is invoke the inscrutable whims of the Creator. But evolution does explain the pattern by invoking a well-known process called convergent evolution. It's really quite simple. Species that live in similar habitats will experience similar selection pressures from their environment. So they may evolve similar adaptations or converge, coming to look and behave very much alike even though they are unrelated. But these species still retain key differences that give clues to their distant ancestry. A famous example of convergence is the camouflaging white coloration shared by diverse Arctic animals such as the polar bear and the snowy owl. The ancestor of marsupials colonized Australia, while placentals dominated the rest of the world. Both placentals and marsupials split into a variety of species, and those species adapted to diverse habitats. If you survive and reproduce better because you burrow underground, natural selection will shrink your eyes and give you large digging claws, be you placental or marsupial. But you'll still retain some characteristic traits of your ancestors. Cacti and euphorbs also show convergent traits. The ancestor of euphorbs colonized the Old World, and that of cacti the Americas. Those species that happened to wind up in the desert evolved similar adaptations. If you're a plant in a dry climate, you're better off being tough and leafless, with a fat stem to store water. So natural selection molded euphorbs and cacti into similar forms. Convergent evolution demonstrates three parts of evolutionary theory working together: common ancestry, speciation, and natural selection. Common ancestry accounts for why Australian marsupials share some features, Females have 2 vaginas and a double uterus, for example, while placental mammals share different features, e.g. a long-lasting placenta. Speciation is the process by which each common ancestor gives rise to many different descendants, and natural selection makes each species well adapted to its environment. Put these together, add in the fact that distant areas of the world can have similar habitats, and you get convergent evolution, and a simple explanation of a major biogeographic pattern. As for how the marsupials got to Australia, that's part of another evolutionary tale, and one that leads to a testable prediction. The earliest marsupial fossils, around 80 million years old, are found not in Australia but in North America. As marsupials evolved, they spread southward, reaching what is now the tip of South America about 40 million years ago. Marsupials made it to Australia roughly 10 million years later, where they began diversifying into the 200-odd species that live there today. But how could they cross the South Atlantic? The answer is that it didn't yet exist. At the time of the marsupial invasion, South America and Australia were joined as part of the southern supercontinent of Gondwana. This landmass had already begun to break apart, unzipping to form the Atlantic Ocean. But the tip of South America was still connected to what is now Antarctica, which in turn was connected to what is now Australia. See Figure 21. Since marsupials had to go overland from South America to Australia, they must have passed through Antarctica. So we can predict this. There should be fossil marsupials on Antarctica dating somewhere between 30 and 40 million years ago. This hypothesis was strong enough to drive scientists to Antarctica looking for marsupial fossils. And sure enough, they found them. More than a dozen species of marsupials, recognized by their distinctive teeth and jaws, unearthed on Seymour Island off the Antarctic Peninsula. This area is right on the ancient ice-free pathway between South America and Antarctica, and the fossils are just the right age, 35 to 40 million years old. After a find in 1982, the polar paleontologist William Zinsmeister was exultant. For years and years, people thought marsupials had to be there. This ties together all the suppositions made about Antarctica. The things we found are what you'd expect we would have. What about the many cases of similar, but not identical species that live in similar habitats but on different continents? The red deer lives in northern Europe, but the elk, which resembles it closely, lives in North America. Tongueless aquatic frogs of the family Pippidae occur in 2 widely separated places, eastern South America and subtropical Africa, and we already learned about the similar flora of eastern Asia and eastern North America. These observations would be puzzling to evolutionists if the continents were always in their present locations. There would have been no way for an ancestral magnolia to disperse from China to Alabama, for freshwater frogs to cross the ocean between Africa and South America, or for an ancestral deer to get from Europe to North America. But we now know precisely how this dispersal did happen, by the existence of ancient land connections between the continents. These are different from the huge land bridges imagined by early biogeographers. Asia and North America were once well connected via the Bering Land Bridge, over which plants and mammals, including humans, colonized North America. And South America and Africa were once part of Gondwana. As organisms disperse and successfully colonize a new area, they often evolve. And this leads to another prediction that we made in Chapter 1. If evolution happened, species living in one area should be the descendants of earlier species that lived in the same place. So if we dig into shallow layers of rocks in a given area, we should find fossils that resemble the organisms treading that ground today. And this is also the case. Where can we dig up fossil kangaroos that most closely resemble living kangaroos? In Australia. Then there are the armadillos of the New World. Armadillos are unique among mammals in having a carapace of bony armor. Armadillo in Spanish means little armored one. They live only in North, Central, and South America. Where do we find fossils resembling them? In the Americas, the home of the glyptodonts, armored plant-eating mammals that look just like overgrown armadillos. Some of these ancient armadillos were the size of Volkswagen Beetles, weighed a ton, were covered with 2-inch thick armor, and sported spiky balls on tails wielded like a mace. Creationism is hard-pressed to explain these patterns. To do so, it would have to propose that there were an endless number of successive extinctions and creations all over the world, and that each set of newly created species were made to resemble older ones that lived in the same place. We've come a long way from Noah's Ark. The co-occurrence of fossil ancestors and descendants leads to one of the most famous predictions in the history of evolutionary biology. Darwin's hypothesis in The Descent of Man, 1871, that humans evolved in Africa. We are naturally led to inquire, where was the birthplace of man at that stage of descent when our progenitors diverged from the catarrhine stock, Old World monkeys and apes? The fact that they belonged to this stock clearly shows that they inhabited the Old World, but not Australia nor any oceanic island, as we may infer from the laws of geographic distribution. In each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extinct species of the same region. It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied to the gorilla and chimpanzee. And as these two species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. At the time Darwin made this prediction, no one had seen any fossils of early humans. As we'll see in Chapter 8, they were first found in 1924 in, you guessed it, Africa. The profusion of ape-human transitional fossils unearthed since then, with the earliest ones always African, leaves no doubt that Darwin's prediction was right. Biogeography not only makes predictions, but solves puzzles. Here's one involving glaciers and fossil trees. Geologists have known for a long time that all the southern continents and subcontinents experienced a massive period of glaciation during the Permian period, about 290 million years ago. We know this because as glaciers move, the rocks and pebbles they carry with them make scratches in the underlying rock. The direction of these scratches tells us which way the glaciers were moving. Looking at the scratches in Permian rocks of southern lands, you see strange patterns. The glaciers seem to have arisen in areas like Central Africa that are now very warm and, even more confusingly, appear to have moved from the seas onto the continents. Note, see the direction of the arrows in Figure 21. Now this is quite impossible. Glaciers can form only in persistently cold climates on dry land, when repeated snows become compacted into ice that begins to move under its own weight. So how do we explain these seemingly willy-nilly patterns of glacial striation and the apparent origin of glaciers in the sea? And there is one more part of this puzzle, involving the distribution not of scratches but of fossil trees, species in the genus Glossopteris. These were conifers that had tongue-shaped leaves instead of needles. Glossa is Greek for tongue. Glossopteris was one of the dominant plants of the Permian flora. For several reasons, botanists believe that they were deciduous, shedding their leaves each fall and regrowing them in spring. They show growth rings, indicating seasonal cycles, and specialized features indicating that leaves were programmed to separate from the tree. These and other traits suggest that Glossopteris lived in temperate areas with cold winters. When you plot the distribution of Glossopteris fossils in the southern hemisphere, the only region in which they are found, note see Figure 21, they form a strange pattern, scattered in swatches across the southern continents. The pattern can't be explained by overseas dispersal, because Glossopteris had large, heavy seeds that almost certainly couldn't float. Could this be evidence for creation of the plant on different continents? Not so fast. Both of these puzzles are solved when we realize where the present-day southern continents really were during the late Permian, figure 21, joined like a jigsaw puzzle into Gondwana. And when you put together the pieces, the position of glacial scratches and the distribution of trees suddenly make sense. The scratches now all point away from the center of Antarctica, which happens to be the part of Gondwana that passed over the South Pole during the Permian. The snows would have produced extensive glaciers spreading away from this location, making scratches in exactly the observed directions. And when the distribution of Glossopteris trees is superimposed on a map of Gondwana, the pattern is no longer chaotic. The patches connect up, running like a ring around the edges of the glaciers. These are precisely the cool locations where temperate deciduous trees would be found. It isn't the trees that migrated from continent to distant continent, then. It is the continents themselves that moved, carrying the trees with them. These conundrums make sense in light of evolution, while creationism is at a loss to explain either the pattern of glacial scratches or the peculiarly disjunct distribution of Glossopteris. There's a poignant footnote to this story. When Robert Scott's party was found in 1912, frozen to death after their unsuccessful attempt to be the first at the South Pole, the Norwegian Roald Amundsen got there a bit earlier. 35 pounds of Glossopteris fossils lay next to their bodies. Despite having discarded much of their equipment in a desperate attempt to stay alive, the party physically dragged these heavy rocks on hand sledges, doubtlessly realizing their scientific value. They were the first specimens of Glossopteris found in Antarctica. The evidence for evolution from patterns of life on continents is strong, but that from life on islands is, as we shall see, even stronger. Islands. Realizing that the distribution of species on islands provides conclusive proof of evolution was one of the greatest pieces of sleuthing in the history of biology. This, too, was the work of Darwin, whose ideas still loom mightily over the field of biogeography. In Chapter 12 of The Origin, Darwin reports fact after fact, painstakingly gathered over years of observation and correspondence, building his case like a brilliant lawyer. When I teach the evidence for evolution to my students, this is my favorite lecture. It's an hour-long mystery story, an accumulation of seemingly disparate data that in the end resolves into an airtight case for evolution. But before we get to the evidence, we need to distinguish two types of islands. The first are continental islands. Those islands once connected to a continent, but later separated either by rising sea levels that flooded former land bridges or by moving continental plates. These islands include, among many others, the British Isles, Japan, Sri Lanka, Tasmania, and Madagascar. Some are old. Madagascar parted from Africa about 160 million years ago. Others much younger. Great Britain separated from Europe around 300,000 years ago, probably during a catastrophic flood spilling from a large dammed-up lake to the north. Oceanic islands, on the other hand, are those that were never connected to a continent. They arose from the seafloor, initially bereft of life as growing volcanoes or coral reefs. These include the Hawaiian Islands, the Galapagos Archipelago, St. Helena, and the Juan Fernandez group described at the beginning of this chapter. The island argument for evolution starts with the following observation. Oceanic islands are missing many types of native species that we see on both continents and continental islands. Take Hawaii, a tropical archipelago whose islands occupy about 6,400 square miles, only slightly smaller than the state of Massachusetts. While the islands are well stocked with native birds, plants, and insects, they completely lack native freshwater fish, amphibians, reptiles, and land mammals. Napoleon's island of St. Helena and the archipelago of Juan Fernandez lack these same groups, but still have plenty of endemic plants, birds, and insects. The Galapagos Islands do have a few native reptiles, land and marine iguanas, as well as the famous giant tortoises. But they too are missing native mammals, amphibians, and freshwater fish. Over and over again, on the oceanic islands that dot the Pacific, the South Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean, one sees a pattern of missing groups, more to the point, the same missing groups. At first blush, these absences seem bizarre. If you look at even a very small patch of a tropical continent or a continental island, say in Peru, New Guinea, or Japan, you'll find plenty of native fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. As Darwin noted, this disparity is hard to explain under a creationist scenario. He who admits the doctrine of creation of each separate species will have to admit that a sufficient number of the best adapted plants and animals have not been created on oceanic islands. But how do we know that mammals, amphibians, freshwater fish, and reptiles really are suited to oceanic islands? Maybe the Creator didn't put them there because they wouldn't do well. One obvious reply is that continental islands do have these animals, so why would a creator put different types of animals on continental versus oceanic islands? How the island was formed shouldn't make a difference. But Darwin ends the sentence given above with an even better response. For man has unintentionally stocked them from various sources, far more fully and perfectly than nature. In other words, mammals, amphibians, freshwater fish, and reptiles often do very well when humans introduce them to oceanic islands. In fact, they often take over, wiping out native species. Introduced pigs and goats have overrun Hawaii, making meals of native plants. Introduced rats and mongooses have destroyed or endangered many of Hawaii's spectacular birds. The cane toad, a huge poisonous amphibian native to tropical America, was introduced to Hawaii in 1932 to control beetles on sugarcane. The toads are now a pest, breeding prolifically and killing cats and dogs who mistake them for a meal. The Galapagos Islands have no native amphibians, but an Ecuadorian tree frog, introduced in 1998, has established itself on 3 islands. On Sao Tome, the volcanic island off the west coast of Africa where I collect fruit flies for my own research, black cobras have been introduced, perhaps accidentally, from the African mainland. They have done so well that we simply won't work in certain areas of the island, as the cobras are so numerous that we can encounter several dozen of these deadly and aggressive snakes in a single day. Land mammals do well on islands too. Introduced goats helped Alexander Selkirk stay alive on Masa Tierra, and they also thrive on St. Helena. Throughout the world, the story is the same. Humans introduce species to oceanic islands where they did not exist, and these species displace or destroy native forms. So much for the argument that oceanic islands are somehow unsuitable for mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and fish. The next step of the argument is this. Although oceanic islands lack many basic kinds of animals, the types that are found there are often present in profusion, comprising many similar species. Take the Galapagos. Among its 13 islands, there are 28 species of birds found nowhere else, and of these 28, 14 belong to a single group of closely related birds, the famous Galapagos finches. No continent or continental island has a bird fauna so heavily dominated by finches. Yet despite their shared finch-like traits, the Galapagos group is ecologically quite diverse, with different species specializing on foods as different as insects, seeds, and the eggs of other species. The carpenter finch is one of those rare species that uses tools, in this case a cactus spine or twig, to pry insects from trees. Carpenter finches fill the ecological role of woodpeckers, which don't live in the Galapagos. And there's even a vampire finch that pecks wounds on the rear ends of seabirds and then laps up the blood. Hawaii has an even more spectacular radiation of birds, the honey creepers. When the Polynesians arrived in Hawaii about 1,500 years ago, they found about 140 species of native birds. We know this from studies of bird subfossils, bones preserved in ancient waste dumps and lava tubes. Around 60 of these species, nearly half the bird fauna, were honey creepers, all descended from a single ancestral finch that arrived on the islands about 4 million years ago. Sadly, only 20 species of honey creeper remain, all of them endangered. The rest were destroyed by hunting, habitat loss, and human-introduced predators like rats and mongooses. But even the few remaining honey creepers show a fantastic diversity of ecological roles, as shown in Figure 22. The bill of a bird can tell us a lot about its diet. Some species have curved bills for sipping nectar from flowers. Others stout, parrot-like bills for cracking hard seeds or crushing twigs. Still others thin, pointy bills for picking insects from foliage. And some even have hooked bills for prying insects from trees, filling the role of a woodpecker. As on the Galapagos, we see one group that is overrepresented, with species filling niches occupied by very different species on continents or continental islands. Oceanic islands also harbor radiations of plants and insects. St. Helena, though lacking many groups of insects, is home to dozens of species of small, flightless beetles, especially wood weevils. On Hawaii, the group that I study, fruit flies of the genus Drosophila, is positively luxuriant. Although the Hawaiian Islands make up only 0.004% of Earth's land, they contain nearly half of the world's 2,000 species of Drosophila. And then there are the remarkable radiations of plants in the sunflower family on the Juan Fernandez Archipelago and St. Helena, some of which have become small woody trees. Only on oceanic islands can small flowering plants, freed from competition with larger shrubs and trees, evolve into trees themselves. So far, we've learned 2 sets of facts about oceanic islands. They are missing many groups of species that live on continents and continental islands, and yet the groups that are found on oceanic islands are replete with many similar species. Together, these observations show that, compared to other areas of the world, life on oceanic islands is unbalanced. Any theory of biogeography worth its salt has to explain this contrast. But there's something more here, too. Listen to the following list of the groups that are often native to oceanic islands, and those that are usually missing. Juan Fernandez is just one group of islands that conforms to the list. Column 1. Native. Plants, birds, insects, and other arthropods, for example, spiders. Column 2. Missing. Land mammals, reptiles, amphibians, freshwater fish. What's the difference between the 2 columns? A moment's thought gives the answer. Species in the first column can colonize an oceanic island through long-distance dispersal. Species in the second column lack this ability. Birds are capable of flying great distances over the sea, carrying with them not only their own eggs, but also seeds of plants they've eaten, which can germinate from their droppings, parasites in their feathers, and small organisms sticking to mud on their feet. Plants can get to islands as seeds floating across expanses of sea. Seeds with barbs or sticky coverings can hitchhike to islands on the feathers of birds. The light spores of ferns, fungi, and mosses can be carried huge distances by the wind. Insects, too, can fly to islands or be taken by winds. In contrast, animals in the second column have great difficulty crossing expanses of sea. Land mammals and reptiles are heavy and can't swim very far, and most amphibians and freshwater fish simply can't survive in salt water. So the kinds of species that we find on oceanic islands are precisely those that can arrive across the sea from distant lands. But what is the evidence that they do so? Every ornithologist knows of occasional visitor birds found thousands of miles from their normal habitat, the victim of winds or faulty navigation. Some birds have even established breeding colonies on oceanic islands in historical times. The purple gallinule, long an occasional visitor to the remote island of Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic, finally started breeding there in the 1950s. Darwin himself did some simple yet elegant experiments showing that seeds from some plant species could still germinate after prolonged immersion in seawater. Seeds from the West Indies have been found on the distant shores of Scotland, obviously carried by the Gulf Stream, and drift seeds from continents or other islands are also found on the shores of South Pacific islands. Caged birds can retain plant seeds in their digestive tracts for a week or more, showing the likelihood of long-distance transport. And there have been many successful attempts to sample insects in the air, using traps attached to airplanes or ships far from land. Among the species collected have been locusts, moths, butterflies, flies, aphids, and beetles. Charles Lindbergh, on a 1933 trip across the Atlantic, exposed glass microscope slides to the air, capturing numerous microorganisms and insect parts. Many spiders disperse as juveniles by ballooning with parachutes of silk. These wanderers have been found several hundred miles from land. Animals and plants can also hitch rides to islands on rafts, logs or masses of vegetation that float away from continents, usually from the mouths of rivers. In 1995, one of these large rafts, probably blown by a hurricane, deposited a cargo of 15 green iguanas on the Caribbean island of Anguilla, where they had not previously existed, from a source 200 miles away. Logs of Douglas fir from North America have been found on Hawaii, and logs from South America have made it to Tasmania. Rafting like this explains the presence of the occasional endemic reptile on oceanic islands, such as the Galapagos iguanas and tortoises. Further, when you look at the type of insects and plants native to oceanic islands, they are from groups that are the best colonizers. Most of the insects are small, precisely those that would be easily picked up by wind. Compared to weedy plants, trees are relatively rare on oceanic islands, almost certainly because many trees have heavy seeds that neither float nor are eaten by birds. The coconut palm, with its large, buoyant seeds, is a notable exception, occurring on almost all Pacific and Indian Ocean islands. The relative rarity of trees, in fact, explains why many plants that are short weeds on continents have evolved into woody tree-like forms on islands. Terrestrial mammals are not good colonizers, and that's why oceanic islands lack them. But they don't lack all mammals. This brings up two exceptions that prove the rule. The first was noted by Darwin. Although terrestrial mammals do not occur on oceanic islands, aerial mammals do occur on almost every island. New Zealand possesses 2 bats found nowhere else in the world: Norfolk Island, the Viti Archipelago, the Bonin Islands, the Caroline and Mariana archipelagos, and Mauritius. All possess their peculiar bats. Why, it may be asked, has the supposed creative force produced bats and no other mammals on remote islands? On my view, this question can easily be answered, for no terrestrial mammal can be transported across a wide space of sea, but bats can fly across. And there are also aquatic mammals on islands. Hawaii has one, the endemic monk seal, and the Juan Fernandez group has a native fur seal. If native mammals on oceanic islands were not created but descended from colonists, you'd predict that those ancestral colonists must have been able to fly or swim. Now, it's clear that long-distance dispersal of a given species to a distant island can't be a frequent event. The chance that an insect or bird could not only traverse vast expanses of sea to land on an island, but also establish a breeding population once it got there, this requires either an already fertilized female or at least 2 individuals of opposite sex, must be very low. And if dispersal were common, life on oceanic islands would be quite similar to that of continents and continental islands. Nevertheless, most oceanic islands have been around for millions of years, long enough to permit some colonization. As the zoologist George Gaylord Simpson remarked, any event that is not absolutely impossible becomes probable if enough time passes. To take a hypothetical example, suppose that a given species has only one chance in a million of colonizing an island each year. It's easy to show that after 1,000,000 years have passed, there is a large probability that the island would have been colonized at least once, 63% to be exact. One final observation closes the chain of logic that secures the case for evolution on islands, and that is this. With few exceptions, the animals and plants on oceanic islands are most similar to species found on the nearest mainland. This is true, for example, of the Galapagos Islands, whose species resemble those from the west coast of South America. The similarity can't be explained by the argument that the islands and South America have similar habitats for divinely created species, because the Galapagos are dry, treeless, and volcanic, quite different from the lush tropics that dominate the Americas. Darwin was especially eloquent on this point. The naturalist, looking at the inhabitants of these volcanic islands in the Pacific, distant several hundred miles from the continent, feels that he is standing on American land. Why should this be so? Why should the species which are supposed to have been created in the Galapagos archipelago and nowhere else bear so plainly the stamp of affinity to those created in America? There is nothing in the conditions of life, in the geological nature of the islands, in their height or climate, or in the proportions in which the several classes are associated together, which closely resemble the conditions of the South American coast. In fact, there is a considerable dissimilarity in all these respects. Facts such as these admit of no sort of explanation on the ordinary view of independent creation. Whereas, on the view here maintained, it is obvious that the Galapagos Islands would be likely to receive colonists from America, whether by occasional means of transport or, though I do not believe in this doctrine, by formerly continuous land. Such colonists would be liable to modification, the principle of inheritance still betraying their original birthplace. What is true of the Galapagos is also true of other oceanic islands. The closest relatives of the endemic plants and animals on Juan Fernandez come from the temperate forests of southern South America, the closest continent. Most of the species on Hawaii are similar, but not identical, to those from the nearby Indo-Pacific region, Indonesia, New Guinea, Fiji, Samoa, and Tahiti, or from the Americas. Now, given the vagaries of winds and the direction of ocean currents, we don't expect every island colonist to come from the closest source. 4% of Hawaiian plant species, for example, have their closest relatives in Siberia or Alaska. Still, the similarity of island species to those on the nearest mainland demands explanation. To sum up, oceanic islands have features that distinguish them from either continents or continental islands. Oceanic islands have unbalanced biotas. They are missing major groups of organisms, and the same ones are missing on different islands. But the types of organisms that are there often comprise many similar species, a radiation, and they are the types of species, like birds and insects, that can disperse most easily over large stretches of ocean. And the species most similar to those inhabiting oceanic islands are usually found on the nearest mainland, even though their habitats are different. How do these observations fit together? They make sense under a simple evolutionary explanation. The inhabitants of oceanic islands descended from earlier species that colonized the islands, usually from nearby continents, in rare events of long-distance dispersal. Once there, accidental colonists were able to form many species because oceanic islands offer lots of empty habitats that lack competitors and predators. This explains why speciation and natural selection go wild on islands, producing adaptive radiations like that of the Hawaiian honey creepers. Everything fits together if you add accidental dispersal, which is known to occur, to the Darwinian processes of selection, evolution, common ancestry, and speciation. In short, oceanic islands demonstrate every tenet of evolutionary theory. It's important to remember that these patterns do not generally hold for continental islands. We'll come to an exception in a second, which share species with the continents to which they once were joined. The plants and animals of Great Britain, for example, form a much more balanced ecosystem, having species largely identical to those of mainland Europe. Unlike oceanic islands, continental islands were cut adrift with most of their species already in place. Now, try to think of a theory that explains the patterns we've discussed by invoking the special creation of species on oceanic islands and continents. Why would a creator happen to leave amphibians, mammals, fish, and reptiles off oceanic islands, but not continental ones? Why did a creator produce radiations of similar species on oceanic islands, but not continental ones? And why were species on oceanic islands created to resemble those from the nearest mainland? There are no good answers. Unless, of course, you presume that the goal of the Creator was to make species look as though they evolved on islands. Nobody is keen to embrace that answer, which explains why creationists simply shy away from island biogeography. We can now make one final prediction. Very old continental islands, which separated from the mainland eons ago, should show evolutionary patterns that fall between those of young continental islands and oceanic islands. Old continental islands, such as Madagascar and New Zealand, cut off from their continents 160 million and 85 million years ago, respectively, will have been isolated before many groups like primates and modern plants had evolved. Once these islands parted from the mainland, some of their ecological niches remained unfilled. This opens the door for some later evolving species to successfully colonize and establish themselves. We can predict, then, that these old continental islands should have a somewhat unbalanced flora and fauna, showing some of the biogeographic peculiarities of true oceanic islands. And indeed, this is just what we find. Madagascar is famous for its unusual fauna and flora, including many native plants and, of course, its unique lemurs, the most primitive of the primates, whose ancestors, after arriving in Madagascar some 60 million years ago, radiated into more than 75 endemic species. New Zealand, too, has many natives, the most well-known being flightless birds. The giant moa, a 13-foot-tall monster hunted to extinction by about 1500. The kiwi, and that fat ground-dwelling parrot, the kakapo. New Zealand also shows some of the imbalance of oceanic islands. It has only a few endemic reptiles, only one species of amphibian, and 2 native mammals, both bats, though a small fossil mammal was recently found. It too had a radiation. There were 11 species of moas, all now gone, and like oceanic islands, the species on Madagascar and New Zealand are related to those found on the nearest mainland, Africa and Australia respectively. Envoy. The main lesson of biogeography is that only evolution can explain the diversity of life on continents and islands. But there is another lesson as well. The distribution of life on Earth reflects a blend of chance and lawfulness. Chance, because the dispersal of animals and plants depends on unpredictable vagaries such as winds, currents, and the opportunity to colonize. If the first finches had not arrived in the Galapagos or Hawaii, we might see very different birds there today. If an ancestral lemur-like creature hadn't made it to Madagascar, that island, and likely the Earth, would have no lemurs. Time and chance alone determine who gets marooned. One might call this the Robinson Crusoe effect. But there is also lawfulness. Evolutionary theory predicts that many animals and plants arriving in new and unoccupied habitats will evolve to thrive there and will form new species, filling up ecological niches. And they will usually find their relatives on the nearest island or mainland. This is what we see over and over again. One cannot understand evolution without grasping its unique interaction between chance and lawfulness, an interaction that, as we'll see in the next chapter, is critically important in understanding the idea of natural selection. But the lessons of biogeography go further, into the realm of biological conservation. Island plants and animals adapt to their environments, isolated from species that live elsewhere. They're potential competitors, predators, and parasites. Because species on islands don't experience the diversity of life found on continents, they aren't good at coexisting with others. Island ecosystems, then, are fragile things, easily ravaged by foreign invaders who can destroy habitats and species. The worst of these are humans, who not only chop down forests and hunt, but also bring with them an entourage of destructive prickly pears, sheep, goats, rats, and toads. Many of the unique species on oceanic islands are already gone, victims of human activity, and we can confidently and sadly predict that many more will vanish soon. In our lifetime, we may see the last of the Hawaiian honey creepers, the extinction of New Zealand's kakapos and kiwis, the decimation of the lemurs, and the loss of many rare plants that, while perhaps less charismatic, are no less interesting. Each species represents millions of years of evolution and, once gone, can never be brought back. And each is a book containing unique stories about the past. Losing any of them means losing part of life's history.